chat window doesn't seem to be opening up yet. We'll find out what's going on when we get farther down. Welcome to tonight's Evolution, or this morning, or whatever time zone you may be in our big little world. Don't forget tortugawordpress.com. There's a slew of stuff there, all freebie PDFs of material. Freely share that with anyone you like. Although a lot of it is older material from the ancient times of 2004 mainly. It's still pretty damn good stuff, and it will get you introduced to an awful lot of things. So anyway, there's our sharing mode there, and we're still not in overlay on our chat. So if there's people watching, absolutely no way of knowing. Let me, however, deal with our absolutely essential, wonderful people, our patrons, who every month are contributing to the project to keep things going along the way they are going. And I must say, constantly in great awe for everybody that has stuck with me all of this time. As an old have dazzle videos and cute animations and all the other little material, it's a very rudimentary talking head. Nonetheless, I try to keep everybody of what's going on in the project and continue at work on it at every point. There we go. So if and when some things pop up in the chat overlay, I'll get that popped up for the whole project. Anyway, as you well know from watching our programs over the last 31, this is episode 31 of the reference bibliography analysis of the creationist book Titans, which does not have a reference bibliography. It's got a rudimentary index, and it has source citations at the end of each chapter, but that's not a really good way to find out what exactly is getting cited, how relevant is it, how current is it, what material is being left out. Unless you have a proper bibliography, it's very difficult to deal with that. So that's what I'm doing in a source analysis. And as well, tracking down the material to see how well it supports the claims that are being made, all of that, which I've done for previous works, including a couple of Nathaniel Jensen works and that. Rupin Sanford's little tome, which Erica has also gone into. Erica Gutsick-Gibbon has gone independently of me. We have a lot of fun. Anyway, finished off chapter 5. And next chapter is going to be on particular taxa within the theropods, and there's actually going to be a little more technical literature that they're lobbing out. But at the moment, they're running over half of their sources are creationists. And I already know a few of the material that's being presented in the next chapter are sources they've already cited elsewhere in the book. So how much new material we'll only be able to find out as we slog along into it. A thing that we'll be keeping in mind, and I'll show you the version that's in the book here, although there will be a version of it in an article that I'll be linking to, is this cute little puppy, which is their geologic transformation tool, which allows the creationists to convert those pesky regular geologic dates into flood geology terms. And you may discover that it's not terribly detailed, and it's not even Sarfati-Tay's idea. It turns out that all they're doing is cribbing Taz Walker from 2021, where he was putting this thing forward, and also cribbing Walker's source, Ord 2010, which argued that, quote, the geological column is in a general flood order with many which when you look in Ord's paper, he's not exactly terribly detailed about discussing too many of the exceptions. So all this is realizing that in this case, Sarfati and Tay are flirting outside the CMI to the Institute for Creation Research bunch that are trying to push the flood boundary past the KT extinction event into the Cenozoic. So now they have the flood waters receding after the KT, and then the fully post-flood down maybe the Pleistocene or so, hard to tell. Their arrows ain't all that detailed. That's reflecting large Tim Clarey worked at ICR. A couple of Clarey stuff gets cited along the way that I'm not going to be putting into we've covered some of this stuff in earlier episodes anyway. But the thing is that CMI has not really jumped full out onto the Cenozoic flood boundary layer, but they're flirting with it here. And they discuss a little bit of on Clarey without really going into the fundamental details. But you mention Tim Clarey's fantasy GG of the dinosaur peninsula. He imagines there was this great big peninsula habitat where critters, as the floodwaters were rising, are coming up and being collected and then ultimately perishing in the flood, which, when you see the actual, is basically the fringes fossils on, you'd realize what they're talking about. Fringe boundary layers on the edge of the great Niabar Seaway that went up through North America back in the Mesozoic. Clarey is trying to push up as a peninsula is in fact a seafloor, around the coasts of which are various well-known dinosaur deposits of critters that tended to come down and do whatever they were doing on the flood drainage patterns coming off of mountain ranges on the west side and east side. A lot of material going on in there. Another thing that struck me about another source that S&T cited from Taz Walker from 1994 on an old creationist paper that Walker had done on the flood boundary issue. And it struck me, why the heck cite it? Because if you go and look, I'll be putting the link up to that. Holy smokes, it's not detailed. I mean, the stuff that in the Taz Walker material isn't detailed much either, but his 1994 stuff is even vaguer and more generic still. So in all of that time from 1994 to 2021, you can get a sense about how the whole creationist attempt to define the flood boundary and to deal with actual geological information is not improving any over all of that time. It's a really great corker. I also discovered some stuff which I'm going to be putting, I'm punting it over because as new material comes along that deserves a part 2 in the show, I basically, unless it's something really important to where I want to dump it on the audience immediately, I'll punt it over to the end of the queue, which at the moment is in the middle of April. The thing that you'll be seeing in April is on a new piece that Jonathan McCutcheon posted at the Discovery Institute on carnivorous plants and how this it poses a tremendous problem for evolution. Well, spoiler alert, it's 2024. And what this posted, and he put it up on Twitter, and various people, Zach Hancock and Dan Stern Cardinale and a few other people were commenting on it, which is how I discovered that it was there, because they were making references to it. And so I looked into this because I had done a show, and for the life of me, I can't remember which episode it was in, but had discussed a bit about carnivorous plants earlier. Material from the 2016-2017 era technicals that were coming up. Well, McClatchy gives me an opportunity to research a little more and find out what has been happening a couple years since then. Turns out quite a lot. So as a matter, there'll be some neat little papers that we'll be putting direct links to, and you'll be able to contrast the ball of fluff that McClatchy is with the technical literature, and worse, what McClatchy was offering as source material, because he was channeling a book chapter from the quasi-intelligent design guy, Wolf Enghart Lunig from Germany, from 2007. He'd written a perfectly okay, co-authored a chapter on the carnivorous plants for this plant encyclopedia online, which, by the way, is not available freebie online, so I'm not going to be putting a link into it. Although Lunig has some of his stuff up his website, this particular item is not one of those that you can find online freebie. So that's helping if you want to try to fact check McClatchy's argument. But when I started looking at the excerpt that I'll be the posting from McClatchy and the excerpts that were in his and the vague references, so he was basically copying stuff from Lunig. It's really old stuff. And so there is a person that he alludes to but doesn't give an indication of when the date was. It turns out that was from a book from 1959. And a source that actually was from 1989, as indicated. And then one that was listed as 2001 is paperback of another book that the quotations and claims involved were in the 1980 original version of it, because it's available online. So all we're talking about is Lunig 2007 channeling poo-poos about how we don't know how carnivorous plants were evolving from stuff from the 1950s and 1980s, which was therefore already some 20 years out of date at the time that Lunig was doing it. Now, to be fair, in part, an awful lot of the research that has came along after 2007. But McClatchy's writing in 2024. So all of that stuff is just another example of how limited and parasitical and boring the intelligent design arguments are. I'm seeing my little wheel spinning around on the overlay on chat. So if anybody is out there, I have no way of knowing it because I'm not getting any signal coming through on that. Anyway, the part 2 on this little matter involves a piece Don Batten put up from last year. 40 failed predictions of evolution, bum, 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 which while we're doing volume 2 of the rocks were there, we are trying to keep track of the various compendium things. And there are several that pop up in the young Earth Grade community where they're offering the reasons why evolution has failed miserably. Here's 15 of them, or 40, or however many they want to come up with. And these are all cosmology and a whole bunch of other stuff. Well, it turns out I don't even have to worry about diving into all of this stuff, although the cosmology material is going to be alluded to in considerable detail in the cosmology that I'm doing for Rocks 2. But it happens that there are 2 independent groups who have dived into this CMI posting. One is from the deliciously meticulous Lawrence Collins, who wrote a very lengthy response to it in November of 2023. And I'll be putting the link to that PDF so everybody can follow up on that. Also, and you'll be getting the link also to Batten's piece, so you can cross compare the two. And then, Collins basically took on the geology, paleontology parts, but there were also astronomy, cosmology, and biology stuff. And for that, there's an absolutely delightful YouTube group video that's done. Dan Stern Cardinale, our dear friend Colton, Mr. Wilford, Zach Hancock, Jordan from Reason to Doubt, who's on the cosmology, and Grayson Base Theory, and co-author Jackson Wheat. So they went through almost all of the examples. We're pointing out how the genetics examples were wrong, how the geology examples were wrong, how the cosmology chapters were wrong, and so forth and so on. And it's quite a good-sized video, 2.5 hours to go through all of this stuff to point out what was going on. But a few little minor blips escaped their attention. And one that didn't get directly mentioned in their responses happened to be on the citation from a 2021 article by Craft et al. On data bacterial genomes involving sulfur-reducing bacterium that involves a single species, but it's all over the planet globally. And they live hunkered down in anaerobic environments down in rock. And the paper was kind of marveling at how stable their genomes are in relation to an awful lot of other bacteria where things have tended to adapt and swiggle much more rapidly. And it turns out it has a somewhat larger genome than similar forms that are found in stable environments. And an important point, not mentioned by or focused on too much by Beecraft, about was the fact that when they get into kind of trouble biologically, these things can hunker down and form an endospore to insulate its DNA from heat and basically hunker down and grow very stably. That's in a 2019 paper by Karnichuk, which is, by the way, from exactly the same journal that the Beecraft paper is from in 2021. But the 2021 paper was finished as of April 2020. So I think it's likely, because it isn't cited in the Beecraft paper, that they may not have been aware of it when they did their work. So part of the reason why I'm regarding this as an evasion is that this Karnichuk paper had gone into quite a great deal about indicating how this endospore issue and the habitat things and circumstances for a very stable, basically freezing itself genetically and hunkering down until conditions can change, has a good chance of having contributed to why its genome has been so comparatively boring and stable and not changing in the way that some other species tend to do under the different circumstances. In addition to how it was able to spread all over the planet in the way that it did because of the circumstances of its endospore capacity and ability to basically put itself in this little stasis until it gets down to somewhere else. Now, the Batten piece was waving this stable genome as somehow indicating that it couldn't possibly be as old in terms of the divergence, which is like 160 million years or something, where they were thinking that the thing had split off from neighbors at that point based on the genetics. Couldn't possibly be true. And non-geneticist Batten, of course, is just simply authority quoting snippets out of this thing. So I thought this was a fun one to put up so that there would be yet another example of where Batten is just playing authority quote games, and all the way also not offering what his alternative model is. How does this fit into how many of these bacterial species, where were they? Were they presented on the ark, or how were they preserved during the flood? Does he have any concept? In other words, is he trying to actively apply his creationist model to this data field to explain why it is what it is waving? And the answer is no. And that's why that it's constantly reminding us of the fact that there is no model there. There is no there, as Gertrude Stein once snarked about Oakland. And I don't see any indication that it's ever going to change. That creationism in principle is stuck in a rut of hand waving. A few of their more proactive ideologues will be like a Don Batten, scavenging around through some of the more technical literature, and they can gotcha quotes from it and plug it into their element, and then they will move on. So that as the years go by, the work proceeds, just as we'll be showing in the case of those Venus flytraps in April. And the creationist isn't paying any attention to it because A, they're not involved in the work, and B, they don't have a model to apply to the work to make any sense out of it, let alone get ahead of the game. If the creation model were as fantastically accurate as the creationists think it is, you would think they would be so far ahead of those pesky old evolutionists year on year on year, that they would be advancing their field and writing their papers up where they're pushing into the field, and the various religious colleges around the planet would be underwriting their research, and people would be flocking to that. The sheer productive elements would be so powerful, a testimony to the accuracy of the model, it to agriculture and to oil discoveries and whatever else. But that's exactly what isn't happening. That for all practical purposes, although creationists will have technical degrees and have done some papers now and then, sometimes collaboratively, sometimes on their own, but they're not exactly at the cutting edge of anything, and certainly not the people that are actually doing the work. my listing, in fact, of the scientists who are responsible for the various technical literature, I typically add in a couple hundred a month, easy. Particularly now that I'm diving into so much of the cosmology material, that field is getting plugged into my data field. So we've got something on the order of like 82,000 scientists that are the authors of the technical papers that I have been gathering to document the various issues that are brought up by creationists, of which that's involving something on the order of 32,000 technical papers over the years. Obviously, this number gets bigger and bigger and bigger because they keep on issuing stuff. That you can therefore look at that body of literature and say, how many of them are creationists? Certainly, are any of them the published creationists who got the flaming flashy names up, either intelligent design or in young Earth creationism? And the answer is none. The closest you can get is somebody, I think, currently at the top of the secondary source citation daisy chain would be Richard Buggs, who has dibble-dabbled. He's conventional, seemingly pro-evolution, not a trivial character on plant evolution and plant biology. Although he's an older fellow, apparently has got religion, and so that's twisted some of the elements as to how he's dealing with things, and he posts on vaguely hinting at design and doing some co-authored stuff, which we mentioned in Rocks Were There, about his wacky paper denying or puzzling over orphan genes with his venue of being an intelligent design. Whether Buggs ends up kind of into that kind of vague Nobel, I've forgotten his first name, Nobel James Tour, or that crowd are squishy doubters of Darwinism and religious agenda kind of from the sidebar. We'll find out over time. I don't know the circumstances on that, but he would be one of the very few examples of somebody who is really fairly high up in the scientific field. So he's got a little bit of cred, although he's not exactly setting the house on fire when he veers off and does more apologetic discussions that he does in these little sidebar papers. Some of it's, he often does little commentaries. And there's kind of a run by Nature magazine. There's, it's a little bit of a blog post level. But at any rate, he does some occasional commentary on that where he's implying there are problems with the materialistic worldview, but he's very squishy and vague about it. And whether or not he can keep that up indefinitely, I don't know. We'll find out. But farther down the food chain, you've got the ones who had prior careers that basically burst into flames because they got on the anti-evolution bandwagon and there's nowhere for them to go with it. Michael Behe would be an example of that. I think Douglas Axe would fall into that category. James Tour may end up in that mode. Of course, from an industrial chemist point of view, I'm sure he has no difficulty just doing regular industrial chemistry work. But his little side hobby, also somebody who has religion, is to gripe about basically origin of life questions. So he's an origins or bust obsessive. And although he tinkers around, it's clear that he must have been reading some young Earth creationist apologetics, because he has been flirting with stuff on soft tissue that supposedly shows that things aren't millions of years old. Well, where could he have gotten that but from creationist apologetics? And so Zach Hancock and a few others, have put up comments. Joel Duff and others are going, what? They're just gobsmacked over this. We'll be alluding to it in volume 2 of the Rocks Were There. One of these days, after Jackson and I finish the various books that we're doing, and we may be writing even more books beyond the ones that we have planned together. But I have a great big stash of material down in my basement on a variety of topics, which can eventually gestate into standalone books. And one of which is the origins or bust, origins of life topic. Because I think it's absolutely fascinating to look into how, not only how the research has advanced over the years, it's still an immensely complicated and difficult subject to resolve and may not be resolved within my lifetime. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if they continue to make in terms of putting together pieces and figuring out what things are happening in what order and how things are working things out and working experimental things to verify stuff. So whether or not anybody can ever generate a self-replicating biosystem that is sufficiently like what we're expecting life to do, that you'd have to say, yeah, this is artificial life. I'm not sure whether that'll take place within my lifetime, but it's not at all impossible, especially if I live for a few more decades, which I'm planning on doing because I need a bunch of Paralogs of Fog novels to finish. So I'm on number 3, and there will be 9 more after that. And by gum, I may be 110 years old by the time I finish the 12th book, but I'm going to plug away with it as best I possibly can. And that keeps my spirit up, because all of this, and also the science work that I do with Jackson and all the rest, is immensely exciting stuff. I am just flabbergasted at how delicious and accessible the information is. For anybody living in this time frame compared to what I grew up with, and the difficulty of finding stuff and how little material. Remember, I'm older than DNA. When I was born, nobody knew that the mechanism of inheritance was DNA. That was only discovered rudimentarily in the 1950s. And then it was only in the 60s that they kind of worked out the codon system. And it was only in the 80s and 90s that they started figuring out homeobox genes. And so there's just layers on layers of stuff that's all within my lifetime. Similarly, in cosmology, where we went from having no clue about how gigantic the universe was, and no clue about whether or not any solar system existed outside of our own, to thousands of them being cataloged and constantly adding new ones on as the newer telescopes look into all this stuff. So all of that's been within my life. It's just absolutely amazing. And not merely within my lifetime, but accessible. That I've gone from just within this century, from material that maybe a scattering of 10, 15, 20%, depending on the discipline of material, might be available somewhere freebie online. Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences, for example, was quite early on making its material from a year old available in access form. And that was one of the forward ones. Now, Nature, Science, and a lot of other journals, and particularly ones in geology and others, are still a lot of it behind firewalls, although there are lots of different ways. And scientists often, when they put up their websites, will put copies of the papers up so that you can find material on that. So one way or the other, it's more like 80% or more of science papers are directly accessible somewhere freebie. So there's no excuse whatsoever for anybody in 2024 to say, oh, I can't find out any of that. It's too difficult to get to. Sorry, mouse click, download, boop, done. Don't give me that. So any person who is claiming to assail regular science, who is not delving into that primary source material, is just plain lazy, or too ignorant to realize that there's a data field out there and that they need to deal with it. Anybody that follows me on Twitter will see how I interact, and occasionally there's some evolution creation spots on Facebook that I belong to as well, and I dive into those periodically because some person will come along and make a little claim, and I keep track of them in my spreadsheets. I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 people that I've bumped into in the last 10 years, and I try to keep track of what their positions are and taxonomize them, and particularly to try to find out if they have the foggiest idea about what any of the sources are, or are they too dishonest to actually present their sources. And there's an awful lot of that in the creationist community, and it's usually a litmus test that you're dealing with a troll. And after I find that they have 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 tweets where they're not really coming clean and discussing any data, not offering any sources, and not showing any capacity to be able to evaluate stuff, I just basically mute them and move on. There's no further point in discussing them. But if they are willing to interact, and it's very rare that you find some of those that can operate at that level, it's interesting to see what material they're drawing on. And so you can then taxonomize them in terms of whether they're drawing off of a particular thing, like they're basically slurping at Answers in Genesis website stuff. Curiously, the older print books, whether intelligent or creationist, I tend to find that modern internet people are 1,000 miles away from that stuff. So the people that are interacting online are not drawing off of print material that they have. Now, some who are vague about their source material, I think were marinated in that sort of stuff, if they're older in particular, because the odds are that they're not riffing off a brand new video on the stuff, that they're often drawing off of material that they had heard about in their church environment or whatever, or maybe some work that they had somebody else read and told them about years ago. But that's that Duane Gish, Henry Morris era, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s stuff. That still has various followers down the line. And as time has gone on, then I've honed my skills in terms of working out litmus tests. You can determine whether somebody is a religious conservative or not by asking them when they think the Exodus took place, because traditionalists will go for 1450, 1500 BCE, whereas anybody that's familiar with the scholarship knows that if it was at all, it's more like 1200 BCE, in other words, some 300 years later, 250, 300 years later, which is the time separating us from the French Revolution and the American Revolution. I mean, it's not a trivial amount of time in terms of human activities. And that will therefore then peg things down, independent of whether they're young Earth or old Earth creationist. Even your conservative, intelligent design person that may be accepting billions of years in principle will still be operating from a frame that's basically Bishop Ussher style apologetics if they think that the Exodus was around 1500 BCE. So all of those are ways of systematizing and organizing and finding out what their data field is. And my approach is that when you have worked out what that data field is, then you can target your questions to examine more and more about their method, and are they aware of the problems of things? If they're dealing with a very dated source field, has it not occurred to them to look into anything more recently, and so forth and so on. It's a different modality than simply throwing information at them, although there often comes a time when I feel like, okay, now it's time to put in a little reference to them and let them see what happens on it. But the vast majority of people that you do that to, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter, are never going to read the paper. Or if they will, they'll just skim, maybe scavenging for something they can latch onto as a supposed case. Wiggle words, that's another cliche that some creationists will deal with, is if they say maybe or could be or anything that's equivocal. Aha! That means they don't have a clear idea. And yet they don't apply that to their own literature, because you can find exactly the same equivocation. Oh, this could be that, or maybe this happened, in creationist apologetics, and not overtly creationist, but religious apologetics. You find the same kind of phrasings used, and yet they don't pounce on that as an example of equivocation. So double standards are part and parcel of this area. Well, I still see my little circle going around and around and around, and we're just a little past half hour. So I think I will probably pull the plug on this show. As usual, the thing finalizes, I'll put links to all the material that we have direct stuff for, so you can follow up on your own. And there are, as always, a link to the Patreon site for new viewers who might say, hey, okay, maybe I could plug a little help to join the parade. And also links to all of the books in ebook. You can find them at ebook, or I put the links into the paperback versions that you can add to your collection. Or if you feel there's somebody that you know that ought to have the books, or Don't rule out the prospect of buying copies and donating them to your local library. So whatever modalities to go, I'm very proud of the works, and also every book that sells is a little bit of royalties for RJ that makes each month a little more manageable in terms of getting from one week to the other and getting all things done. Anyway, Jackson has sent me the chapter on origin of tetrapods and related topics for the new book. And I've been now going through that to get all the documentation organized and put into the master bibliography, and all the topics put into the master index, having some of the material in my own immediate frame. And I got a big stuff in the basement that had been sequestered as follow-up material, some of which I'm sure will be ending up as info boxes on a lot of the deep genetic dive as to the origin of paired appendages and brain systems and biological systems. There's an awful lot of technical literature in this area, plus coverage of the various creationist apologetics that have tried to tiptoe into this area and blunder, and why. So all of that stuff will be folded in once I get through Jackson's chapter and get all that material gone in. And then, of course, by that, I suspect then he'll have another chapter to lob off for me. And so we proceed like a giant assembly line to work on the work. And maybe by the end of the year, or it may spill over into 2025. It's a lot of material to come in. I'm keeping track of the incoming of ICR's Acts and Facts to make sure that their various apologetics that are touching on topics that we have discussed in the new book are included into that. Fortunately, there are fewer of those every year, because in the old days, Acts and Facts during their super heyday, just, I think it's been about 3 or 4 years ago, they were still doing monthly issues. And now they're still doing functionally the same size issue, but only bi-monthly now. So I suspect, one, it's tough to fill, even with the level of repetition they were fond of. To some extent, there was a great deal of it was recycling old Henry Moore's posts as well. And so by flipping over to a bi-monthly modality, they've dropped off a lot of that stuff. They still have their little small network of writers, Tim Clarey and Snelling does things there every once in a while, a little bit of Bergman every once in a while, and James Johnson. There's a relatively small coterie of people. If you gathered all of the pundits that come up with Acts and Facts issues, and Brian Thomas. Thomas is going to be mentioned a lot in the new book, just as he was in the other one, because in part, Brian Thomas is practically the point man lightning rod for creationists blathering on about soft tissue. He's been banging that drum for an awful long time, and he just bumps this stuff out again and again and again. It's relentless from dear old Brian. So there's a lot of citations in that's going to be on that stuff. So anybody that comes in it from a scholarly point of view that wants to follow up on a lot of this, it's going to be fun. So anyway, still seeing a little spinning circle over in the overlay. So if people have been watching the show, I apologize for not being able to say hi. And if you have desperate questions that you wanted me to answer, or comments that you wanted me to deal with, I'm sorry, I can't see them at all. So we're coming up on 40 minutes. Let me put my advert for the Rocks for Their book, which I know is very loud. And and we'll see again. Bon appetit. And so there's the advert for The Rocks Were There, Volume 1. We hope once Volume 2 is out, we'll see if we can arrange to have a interview with on Pelagia's show, because that had a big boost for he has a much bigger audience. Maybe Gutsick Gibbon can have us on in that. We can get a few of these things, because she has just hit, I think, her 100,000th subscriber. That would be a nice one. Hear that, Erica? We Jackson and I want to go on to do a plug for Rocks Were There once we got that second volume out. Plus, some evolution stuff is in Volume 2, so that's up your alley. Logical connection point. Anyway, everybody stay careful for rampaging killer penguins who are coming off of defending the flat Earth ice wall. They're there with their laser guns. And especially the wooden penguins, which are very stealthy, because like Doctor Who's frozen angels, they'll move on you when you're not looking. So we'll all catch you next week with another dual episode, unless by lightning or an asteroid hits my house, which would probably make the papers. We'd be hearing on that. So everybody stay safe. Watch out for bad weather and not getting bombed on if you're in places where that's happening. And because some of the patrons and people that I know are the Ukraine war zone. I mean, there's a lot of people around in a lot of different spots, and there's so many places for people to not be in a safe place. So everybody take care, and we will see you all next week.